Ethnobotany is the study, in the simplest term, it's the study of plants and people. It's the study of the way that people interact with plants, usually in traditional societies, but not necessarily. So all the things that people use plants for, ranging from medicine to construction materials to textiles to foods, is all legitimate material for ethnobotanists to study. And ethnopharmacology is a little more restricted because ethnopharmacology focuses on, the formal definition of ethnopharmacology is the interdisciplinary scientific study of biologically active substances used or observed by indigenous people. So there are a few caveats. For one thing, it's not restricted to plants, right? A lot of what ethnopharmacology studies might be things that come from animals. Obviously, a lot of it has to do with the study of plant medicines or things used as medicines. But also, toxins are a good part of it. The study of arrow poisons, for example, is certainly part of ethnopharmacology. So ethnopharmacology, as the name implies, the ethno part is about people and the pharmacology side is about pharmacology and the study of drugs. So it's interdisciplinary. It focuses on all the ways in which people interact with drugs and toxins, so it includes everything from pharmacology to chemistry to anthropology to medicine, public health, you name it, toxicology, all of that. It relates to shamanism because in these indigenous or traditional cultures, usually the shaman is the person with the knowledge of the plants that are psychoactive and or medicinal. He's the person, he or she is the person that knows how to use these things. They're the keepers of the plant knowledge in a way. So that's, they're more than herbalists, but they're also the herbalists. They're the ones that know their medicines and how to use them for whatever purposes, spiritual and medical as well. In shamanism, and one of the things that distinguishes it from mere herbalism is that the shaman is a specialist in altered states of consciousness. The famous anthropologist and scholar Mircea Eliade calls shamanism the archaic techniques of ecstasy. And in shamanism, the shaman deliberately is a master of various techniques for inducing altered states of consciousness, which may involve the use of psychoactive drugs, but not always. There are other techniques too that can be used, like frenzied drumming or dancing or flagellation or extremes of physical stresses to induce altered states. But the idea is to deliberately induce an altered state, and the shaman goes on a journey. This is the primary mode throughout the world, that the shaman journeys to the center of the world, which may be visualized as a tree. It's often visualized as a tree or some kind of axis, but that axis unites the upper world, the middle world, our ordinary world, and the lower world. And the shaman is a person who is able to navigate these realms and knows how to move around in these realms and actually retrieve information and come back. Or a lot of what the shaman does is curing. It's related to curing, and in shamanic traditions, the understanding often is that illness is caused by loss of soul, and that the soul has wandered off and is out in these realms, and the shaman has to go and find the soul and restore it to the person's body, and then cure the illness that way, whether the illness is physical or mental. And there's not really a distinction always made. In fact, all illness in these traditions is usually understood to basically be due to witchcraft or some sort of malevolent influence, even physical illness. So the shaman is a specialist in this technique, and they are often a specialist in the use of plants for inducing altered states of consciousness. That's the realm. So in some ways, the shaman fulfills a function for the society in that he or she is the person with one foot in both worlds. He's a foot in the real world of everyday human affairs and the world of spirits and the supernatural. So they can be a conduit of communication between those worlds. And in some ways, that's like a priest. A priest represents the people to the realm of spirits and so on, but the shaman actually goes to these places and not just talks to these people, to these entities or whatever, but moves in these dimensions, which are very real experientially for the shaman and for the people. And so curing is part of it, but also other things of concern to the community, where to look for game, for example, where to find when to plant the crops. All of this stuff comes from this realm of sort of supernatural knowledge. So the shaman is a wise person, the keeper of knowledge and the connection to knowledge. So that's kind of a long-winded explanation, but the shaman has, wears many hats in some ways. He or she fulfills multiple functions for the society. So these psychedelics and other types of what you might call psychoactive molecules are found widespread in plants and even animals and fungi and the whole thing. I mean, they're all over the place. So I think in one sense that seems remarkable to us, but in another sense we shouldn't really be surprised, because this is a reflection simply of biochemical evolution. I mean, we are evolved from the same ultimate origins that the plants are and the fungi are. So the fact that there are molecules in these organisms that mimic neurotransmitters and interact with neurotransmitter receptors and so on is just to be expected in a sense, in that, most of these psychoactive molecules are, one or two steps from amino acids. The alkaloids generally come from amino acids, and especially the example of DMT, where tryptophan is an amino acid, and it's in all organisms because it goes into proteins. It's one of the amino acids that goes into proteins. But two enzymatic steps, two steps away from tryptophan, is DMT. And the enzymes that do that conversion are pretty much found in any cell. So it's not too surprising in a way that DMT is very widespread, because it's only two steps away from what they call primary metabolism. In other words, the metabolism that we share with everything. fact that these neurotransmitter-like substances are out there in the plant kingdom, or the fungal kingdom, or even the animal kingdom, is not as remarkable as the fact that, indigenous people living immersed in these highly chemically diverse ecologies have become very clever about discovering these things and figuring out how to use them, in their shamanic traditions. And this is, this in some way is more remarkable than the fact that the compounds are there. It's that people have evinced a lot of ingenuity in digging these things out and figuring out how to make them active. Like, for example, again, DMT is a very powerful psychedelic, but it is not orally active. So you can eat plants all day that contain DMT and nothing will happen because it's inactivated, as you know, by an enzyme in the gut called monoamine oxidase. And but indigenous people have figured out that there are also plants that contain monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and they've figured it out through trial and error or whatever, that if you combine a plant containing DMT with a plant containing a monoamine oxidase and MAO inhibitor, then it becomes very active. And how did they figure that out? Was it through trial and error? Not so clear, because there are many plants out there and many potential combinations. So how did they figure that out? Nobody really knows. But the point is they were, motivated enough to seek out these altered states that they actually did figure it out. They approached it, I don't know how, either accidentally, which seems unlikely, or through trial and error, which seems also unlikely. Who knows how they figured it? Maybe animals do this thing. Maybe they watch animals. I mean, what they will tell you, as you know, in South American traditions, you say, how'd you figure out how to combine, Banisteriopsis bark, which contains the MAO inhibitor, with the leaves of chacruna, which contains DMT, and come up with this very powerful orally active psychedelic? They will say, well, the plants told us how to do this. And, as a Westerner, you just scratch your head and you say, well, that's ridiculous. I've never heard such a ridiculous thing. But they'll always tell you that, So, who knows? There does seem to be, in some way, I mean, the shamans and other people that use these things will say, half the reason they take these, it's not just to induce altered states, it's to learn things. And a lot of what they like to learn, a lot of the reason they take them is to learn about the properties of plants. What they're good for, what their biodynamic properties are, what they might be used to treat or cure, or what their psychoactive effects are. So a lot of what motivates the shaman, I think, in their relationship to nature is the same thing that motivates scientists. The shaman is a kind of scientist. It's curiosity. They want to know, what does this plant do? And what does this plant do if I combine it with this plant? So it's really a very experimental approach that they're taking to all this. And they do learn. And I think that one thing that shaman do, and if you look at the ayahuasca tradition, one thing that they do is, in exploring these altered states, they have become very adept at sort of monitoring their own inner landscape and their own physiological state. So, they sort of have a baseline. They know what the baseline, state of ayahuasca is. And then if they put another plant in there, in that mix that they want to investigate, they can see how does that move the experience away from baseline So in some ways they can acquaint themselves with what that plant might do in a very sort of hands-on, direct, experimental way. And I think that that's a lot of what goes on in this kind of shamanism. This is how this pharmacopoeia gradually built up over, you know, centuries, essentially through experimentation, through experimental, like empirical bioassay, if you will. Well, I do. Actually, I do personally think that it did, and I think that a lot of what is coming out of sort of the frontiers of neuroscience right now supports that. You know, we now have these brain imaging tools and these sophisticated tools, so we can look at people, what's happening in their brains when they are in profoundly altered states of consciousness, either on psychedelics or in, you know, in mystical states of various types or deep meditation. We can actually see what part of the brain is lighting up, in a word, and mediating these things. So I think, I mean, just last week there was a whole new study published about how they've located, you know, what they're calling the God spot. You know, so the brain is architecturally and physiologically set up to experience these transcendent states. And certain drugs will activate them, and certain practices will activate these brain areas, and there's a lot of overlap, for example, between you know, the areas of the brain that are activated by psilocybin, which is one of the ones that's been looked at, and deep meditation. You know, there's a lot of overlap. So I do think that, you know, the spiritual experience is kind of built into the human brain. And the larger question is, or the more interesting question is, why should it be? And what is the use of that? What is the evolutionary advantage of being able to have transcendent experiences? Or is there one, you know? Whole issue about what language is and the association, you know, of sound and symbol and all that, which is the basis of language. And language, more than anything else, probably is what sets us apart from everything else in nature. I mean, we are immersed in an ocean of language, an ocean of symbols, where symbols are linked to sounds. And, you know, I can sit here and utter meaningless sounds, essentially inherently meaningless sounds, but they make sense to you because they evoke meaningful mental pictures. And this is the thing, you know, and the brain architecture is set up to experience synesthesia. And synesthesia is one of these functions that, you know, the translation of one sensory modality into another. So you can, you know, hear colors and that sort of thing, or see sounds and that sort of thing, and that is also the basis of language when you think about it. And psychedelics are interesting in this respect because psychedelics are one of the few ways that you can reliably induce these synesthetic experiences. It's very common to have synesthesia. On psychedelics, some people are genetically endowed with synesthesia, and they just experience that all the time. I have the strong intuition that children below a certain age are probably spontaneously synesthetic all the time, because the brain structures that separate these different sensory modalities are not set in place yet. So it's very common for children to have synesthetic experiences, and that is a part of brain development and growing up and learning to speak and all that. If you look at genetically synesthetic people, about 1 in 100 persons is genetically synesthetic, meaning it happens spontaneously to them. If you look at those people, it is very common. It's usually the rule that it's very closely linked to their apprehension of words and numbers, right? And they will say, the number 13 is, smooth and hard and dark blue, and for them, it's absolutely an apprehendable thing that it's like that. Or the letter, A is, purple polka dots. And they're not making this up. This is real for them. So it says something about the way that the centers in our brain that process meaning, process language, work, and how they tie into these sensory pathways. If you think about the fact that psychedelics can evoke this synesthesia rather easily, I mean, you don't have to go very far before you can imagine a hungry primate, a languageless primate out there foraging on mushrooms or whatever, accidentally or whatever, or deliberately, but first initially accidentally. They take them. Mushrooms are a good candidate because they don't require any processing. No MAO inhibitors required. You just reach down and eat them up, and it spontaneously elicits this thing, and it very easily triggers synesthesia. Well, and you can imagine, the person finds this is why chanting and singing and all this has so much to do with shamanism, because it modulates the visions. So that person can, start shouting and singing and chanting, and suddenly what's happening behind the eyes goes crazy, right? And then they pick up a stick and start beating a hollow log, and hey, that's even cooler, they bring in rhythm. Well, so they've just invented language, music, musical instruments, all that's poetry, all in one productive session.
And obviously,
and it makes you feel good. It induces ecstasy. So you only have to do it spontaneously or accidentally a couple of times, and then you get it, and then you sort of say, well, hey, that was great. That made me feel good. So then you go back to repeat it. Who knows about the way to interpret these myths, but in the forbidden fruit, it was the tree of knowledge, right? It wasn't, it was knowledge that was forbidden. Curiosity was not encouraged. We were, what was encouraged, or what we were more or less commanded to do in the context of this myth, was to remain not really human, to remain like animals, innocent, and to not know about things like our own individuality and things like death, and that was the thing. I think, and at some point, I mean, the whole thing about Adam and Eve and the tree of knowledge is, of course, a myth, but it's really about at what point did we separate from, did we achieve self-reflection, right? This is what animals don't have. Well, by and large, I mean, there are evidence that maybe some of them do to some extent, but I think two things. The idea that, you have an I sense, a sense of an I, and the sense of probably knowledge of, or the intuition of your own mortality. That's the loss of innocence, I think that in the context of fundamentalist Christianity, thinking is not encouraged. I mean that's what they're trying to get away from. That's the whole thing. You lost innocence. You lost innocence because you asked too many questions and you thought too much and you questioned things, right? And this is what Christianity discourages, at least the fundamentalist type. Christianity is sort of foisting the notion on people that there are simple answers to complex questions, and I mean I call it simple answers for simple people. Thinking is not encouraged. Asking questions is not encouraged. It's all about, here's the doctrine and you must accept it. You must accept it on faith. If you have no faith, you're lost, and that's the whole thing. And faith is essentially asking someone to accept a premise or a set of ideas or something without any evidence. And without asking too many embarrassing questions about it. So, I mean, on the personal level, I have no respect for faith. I don't see that it has much usefulness, and I make a distinction between faith and spirituality. I mean, I think that spirituality has usefulness and maybe even evolutionary usefulness, as all this neuroscience is indicating. But faith is being, faith is being asked to accept a crock without any evidence. Why should you? It's being asked to give up your capacity for asking questions and making your own judgments and exercising critical thinking. Well, why should we do that? Right. Those are the abilities that make us human. That's just something I came up with when I was musing sort of about what are these things really, psychedelics, and what is their overall impact on our species as on the evolutionary level, and the analogy is not that far from the whole monolith motif in 2001, right? I mean, the monolith, you've seen 2001, right? Who hasn't seen 2001? Right, but the monolith is, in some ways, a symbol for this unknowable thing that appears and intervenes in human affairs or influences human affairs at sort of critical junctures. in our evolutionary odyssey. And, you know, psychedelics are kind of like that in some ways. I mean, they're not from another star system. They're not, necessarily from, but there's something in nature that can profoundly influence human thought at critical junctures. And the idea is, we think we know a great deal about these psychedelics. I mean, when we do, in some ways, we know where they come from. We know what their chemistry is. We're learning more and more about how they work on the brain and so on. But there's a lot about, and we're looking, at ways to sort of make something of this, make something useful of it. And the obvious application is like medical uses, right? They can be used to treat mental illness or post-traumatic stress syndrome and all that. And all that is true, but I don't think that's the end of it, sort of. I mean, I think that, and that's where the starship analogy comes from. If we're like, a band of monkeys or something scampering through the jungle and we come on this crashed starship, we have no idea what it really is, but we're crawling all over it, and we're, looking at the blinking lights, and we're, maybe breaking off a piece of it and look at it, and hey, it has, curing properties or whatever, and we're only looking at a fragment of it. We're only looking at fragments of it. We don't really comprehend it. But I think what psychedelics are in the evolutionary context, we haven't really comprehended, But I think that, they are part of this process of moving us forward, moving us as a species toward some kind of singularity or something, some kind of transformation, as a species. And I know that, this is heresy when it comes to evolution, because evolution is not supposed to be guided and so on, and and it's not really guided, but it's just that these triggers are there, and the fact that there are psychedelics in nature, and that we have discovered them, and that we have a brain that is uniquely sort of evolved to interact with these things, and these psychedelics make us have unconventional ideas, means that there's more going on here than simply Darwinian mechanics. I mean, in other words, when you inject consciousness into the situation, then all bets are off. I mean, for example, if you look at evolution, biological evolution has little or nothing to do with how we're evolving now. I mean, cultural evolution took over a long time ago. And now we're at a point where we're going to, seize the controls of biological evolution. It's not natural selection that's going to determine the future of evolution. We're going to design ourselves. We're already in the process of doing that. So consciousness has completely changed the direction of evolution. So there is, something has erupted, something of a completely different order, and that is consciousness, that is mind, that is radically changing the direction of evolution. And if it hadn't intervened, we'd probably be going in a very different direction than we are. But as it is, we're in the process of evolving into something that is either not human or post-human, or pushes the envelope of what it is to be human, what we think of as human. question, and we don't really know. I mean, one of the things that the psychedelics do is they tend to present themselves as autonomous, as an entity, and either the focus is on the psychedelic itself, and it's like the mushrooms are saying this or whatever. Well, the mushrooms are not saying anything. I mean, any rational assessment is that, the trip is not in the drug. This is a mistake that people make, or a misperception that people make. The trip's in your head. The drug is just a catalyst. Having said that, it does persistently kind of often present itself as you're in a dialogue, you're in a communication with another intelligence. And, which doesn't seem to be you. But, on the rational level, you say, well, this has to be a part of myself that has split off and is turning around and presenting itself as something that's not me, but it has to be me. What else could it be, right? So that's the rational, way of looking at it. And maybe that is what it is, and maybe that's what these entities are. But then, maybe not. And this is always the trick, in some sense. How do you, my brother used to say, how do you, if it really is another entity, and it claims to know things that you don't know, how do you get it to tell you something that you could not possibly know? Because that would be pretty good evidence that it's not you, And then if you could, but it's very, very tricky to get it to actually tell you something that you can't possibly know, So then you're in this ambiguous place, where you don't know whether it's part of you or part of something else, something that's not you. This is another question, too, that has to do with, how is consciousness generated? Is consciousness something that the brain generates, an epiphenomenon of the activity of the brain in some ways? Or is the brain more like a detector of consciousness? And, maybe consciousness is like the ether or something in the old physics. It's something that permeates the continuum. And this is what Eastern philosophy has said, that mind precedes matter, that consciousness is, the substrate of all being. And the brain then becomes some kind of a detector more than it is a generator, or it becomes a detector and an interpreter, a processor. Well, if it's a detector of consciousness in the way that a radio receiver is a detector of radio waves, and you change the channel and you get different messages coming in, maybe that's the way it works. And if that's the way it works, then it's much easier to sort of visualize or imagine that there really are sort of other intelligences out there in this, in this land of consciousness, this field of consciousness, and that, you pick up on them, you come in touch with them, much as the way a ham radio operator can pick voices up out of the radio spectrum. Same kind of thing. And maybe it's that. Maybe it's something like that. I don't really think that neurophysiology can say one way or the other. I mean, I think that, to some extent, I think it does generate consciousness. The brain certainly, it certainly processes information. It's a receptor for information. It processes it and turns it into, some kind of a model of reality that we can navigate in, that we can inhabit, and that more or less makes sense. But is that all there is to it? Could there not also be a detection function going on here. And I don't think that neurophysiology can say right now. I mean, I'm sure there are lots of neurophysiologists who will ridicule this notion, but prove it or disprove it. Yeah, well, there is a difference. There are some differences. At base, it's all part of this tryptamine, visionary dimension, the kinds of dimensions that are typical of these tryptamines. But it's like they're different facets of them. I mean, if the different preparations, it's like looking through a prism at the same thing, but from different angles, sort of. And I mean, DMT, the smoke synthetic, presents itself, as it's a very rapid kind of overwhelming thing where your mind is just flooded with all these colors and all these apparent entities, and like you said, this circus-like atmosphere where everything is bouncing around and it seems very ecstatic, and there are these, whatever you want to call them, clowns, self-transforming elf machines, entities that are kind of like, look at this, almost frenetic in a way. So that's what DMT is like. Mushrooms can be that way at very high doses, but tend to be a little bit more slowed down in some ways, but it's the same dimension, the same modalities, the same motifs that you see, under the influence of mushrooms, and this feeling of, sort of mischievousness, this elfin quality. The mushrooms are like children; they're like little children. Kind of. There is that feeling of humorousness almost, mischievousness with the mushrooms. And ayahuasca presents itself somewhat differently to me subjectively. For one thing, the mushrooms and the DMT elves or whatever are not really, they don't really seem to be gendered. That's not a aspect of it. They're asexual or whatever, you don't think of them as male or female. Ayahuasca always presents itself to me, and I think to most people, as a feminine entity. And, sometimes, usually for me, a kind, feminine entity. There is that feeling, there is this feminine, sort of, and they call, ayahuasca the mother, and it's kind of like your mother, Well, ayahuasca's, yeah, it's slower, it's much slower compared to that, that's right. Which is simply a function, I think, of the pharmacokinetics of the thing. I mean, DMT, smoked DMT, is metabolized very rapidly, and it's like, it unfolds very rapidly and it goes away very rapidly because of the way it gets into the brain. But with the ayahuasca, the MAO inhibitors prolong that. So in some ways, I mean, a crude analogy maybe is if DMT is the speeded up tape version of the experience, then ayahuasca is the tape slowed down to normal speed, that kind of thing. And mushrooms too, the same way. I mean, mushrooms have a slower pharmacokinetics. They take longer to get into the brain, they stick around longer, and they go away more slowly than DMT.
my one